January 17, 1943, North Africa. 8:47 hours. The morning sun climbed over the Tunisian hills like molten copper poured across a canvas of sand and stone. In the back of a stripped-down Willys Jeep bouncing across the hardpan southeast of Kasserine Pass, Private First Class Eugene Morrison gripped the twin handles of a Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun, his knuckles white against the black metal still cold from the desert night. The air tasted of diesel exhaust and dust. Behind him, stretched across 12 miles of broken terrain, the American II Corps was repositioning after 3 weeks of confused contact with Rommel's Afrika Korps, Green. Troops learning the mathematics of modern War I. Miscalculation at a time. Morrison was 22 years old. He had fired the Browning exactly 4 times in combat. His hands still trembled slightly when he touched the butterfly trigger, not from fear but from the memory of what the gun could do. The way it bucked and roared. The way spent brass cascaded like golden rain. The way targets simply ceased to exist in clouds of dust and fragment. The Army manual prescribed short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds. Discipline, conservation, control. Every gunnery instructor from Fort Benning to the staging camps in Morocco had drilled it into him with the monotony of scripture. Short bursts, always short bursts. What Morrison did not know, what none of them knew that morning as the Jeep column dispersed into defensive positions along a dried wadi, was that in approximately 4 minutes, the doctrine he had memorized would become completely irrelevant. The sound arrived first. Not the engines, those came later, but something else. A kind of wailing that seemed to come from the air itself, rising and falling like a predator's cry. The Germans called it the Jericho trumpet, a wind-driven siren mounted on the landing gear of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, designed specifically to terrorize ground troops during the terminal phase of attack. It was psychological warfare rendered as acoustics, and it worked. Across the wadi, Morrison saw men look up, then freeze, their bodies locked in the awful calculus of whether to run or take cover or simply wait for the mathematics of high explosive to resolve their uncertainty. Morrison looked up. 3 shapes were falling, out of the sun, to understand what happened. In those next seconds, to comprehend the forbidden rhythm that would save Morrison's life and end 3 others. One must first understand what the American military believed about automatic weapons fire in early 1943 and why they believed it. The doctrine was born from the First World War, refined in the interwar years by men who had watched machine guns chew through ammunition belts at apocalyptic rates during the static slaughter of trench warfare. The Lewis gun, the Hotchkiss, the Vickers, all had demonstrated that sustained automatic fire was profoundly wasteful. Overheating, barrel wear, ammunition exhaustion. The mathematics were simple. A machine gun fired at cyclic rate would empty its ammunition supply in minutes, and resupply in combat was never guaranteed. Therefore discipline. Therefore short bursts. Therefore the sacred doctrine of 3 to 5 rounds. Pause, assess, re-engage. The Browning M2 had a cyclic rate of approximately 450 to 600 rounds per minute, depending on headspace adjustment and ammunition load. In theory, this meant a trained gunner could fire 7 to 10 rounds per second. In practice, Army doctrine demanded he fire fewer than 1 per second in controlled packages, leaving the gun cold and the ammunition belt full. It was rational. It was economical. It was designed for a kind of war that was already obsolete. Eugene Morrison had been trained in this doctrine. He had internalized it. He believed in it the way a seminarian believes in catechism, not because he had tested it against reality, but because authority had made it true through repetition. At Fort Benning, his instructors had been veterans of the First World War, men with wire-brush mustaches and distant eyes who spoke about machine guns with the reverence reserved for dangerous, necessary things. They had shown him how to clear a jam, how to adjust for windage, how to conserve ammunition against the possibility of encirclement. They had never shown him what to do when 3 aircraft were falling toward him at 300 miles per hour with the specific intention of turning his body into component parts. The The Stukas came down in their signature. Near vertical dive, wings pulled back, landing gear extended with those screaming sirens howling like the damned. Morrison could see the bombs slung beneath the lead aircraft. A single SC-250, 250 kilograms of high explosive, designed to crater roads and collapse bunkers. Standard operating procedure for the Luftwaffe in North Africa. Dive from altitude, release at low level, pull out hard, egress at speed before anti-aircraft fire could find the range. The pilots were experienced. They had done this over Poland, over France, over the burning steppes of Russia. They expected what everyone expected, that the Americans would scatter, that ground fire would be sporadic and inaccurate, that the boys from Brooklyn and Oklahoma and California would learn today what the boys from Warsaw and Rotterdam and Smolensk had learned before them, that air superiority was not an abstract concept but a physical fact delivered at terminal velocity. Morrison did not scatter. Instead, he did something that violated every principle of his training. He pulled the butterfly trigger of the Browning M2 all the way back, locked it into sustained fire, and held it there. The gun roared, not in bursts, not in controlled packages. It roared in one continuous industrial bellow, a sound like the tearing of metal fabric, like foundry work, like some vast engine of violence running at full capacity. The Browning hammered against its mount, brass ejecting in a molten stream, the barrel already beginning to glow dull red at the chamber. Tracer rounds, every fifth bullet, painted a solid line of fire into the sky, a visible arc connecting Earth to aircraft like a bridge made of light and death. 11 seconds. That was how long Morrison held the trigger. 11 seconds of sustained fire that consumed approximately 110 rounds from the ammunition belt. In those 11 seconds, physics became visible. The tracers did not scatter randomly. They formed a pattern, a rhythm, that later analysts would struggle to explain. Morrison was not aiming in the conventional sense. He was not calculating lead or deflection. He was feeling the rhythm of the dive, matching his fire to the Stuka's descent trajectory, walking the stream of bullets into the path of the aircraft the way a musician walks a melody into harmony. The first Stuka flew directly into the stream. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The 50 caliber rounds, each one a 42-gram projectile traveling at 900 meters per second, struck the Stukas, engine cowling, the wing root, the cockpit canopy. Metal shredded. Glass exploded. The dive angle changed from controlled to catastrophic. The aircraft did not pull out. It simply continued its trajectory into the desert floor at full velocity, impacting with a sound like thunder, a fireball rising lazy and orange into the morning air. Morrison did not stop firing. The second Stuka, seeing its leader go down, attempted to break left, a standard evasive maneuver that should have carried it clear of the kill zone. But Morrison's rhythm had already adapted. He traversed the gun smoothly, instinctively, the stream of fire following the break like water following a channel. The tracers found the Stuka's tail section. Control surfaces disintegrated. The dive became a spin. The pilot ejected. Morrison saw the canopy blow and the figure tumble, but ejection at low altitude in a spin was simply death with extra steps. The aircraft hit 3 seconds later, 400 meters from the first impact. The third Stuka pilot did what he had been trained to do: abort the attack, gain altitude, egress. He released his bomb early. It detonated uselessly in empty desert, and hauled back on the stick, the Stuka's inverted gull wings straining as the aircraft clawed for sky. For a moment it seemed he would escape. The dive had carried him past Morrison's position. He was climbing now, almost 500 meters distant, the Browning's effective range falling away with each second. Morrison did not stop firing. The rhythm held. The tracers arced upward, a parabola of light chasing the fleeing aircraft. Later, ballistics experts would examine the wreckage and determine that of the approximately 110 rounds Morrison fired, only 11 struck aircraft. 3 hit the first Stuka. 5 hit the second. 3 hit the third at extreme range as it attempted to climb away. 3 rounds. 1 punctured the fuel tank. One severed a hydraulic line. One, impossibly, statistically, absurdly, entered the cockpit through the rear canopy glass and struck the pilot in the base of the skull. The Stuka rolled inverted and fell. Morrison released the trigger. The sudden silence was physical, a pressure against the eardrums. Smoke rose from the Browning's barrel. The metal was hot enough to shimmer. Morrison's hands were shaking. Around him, men were emerging from cover, staring at the 3 columns of black smoke rising from the desert, staring at Morrison, saying nothing because there were no words for what they had just witnessed. Eugene Morrison had violated every principle of his training. He had fired sustained automatic fire in direct contravention of doctrine. He had expended 110 rounds in 11 seconds when regulations demanded he conserve ammunition. He had overheated the gun barrel to the point of potential failure. He had done everything wrong, and he had shot down 3 aircraft with 11 bullets. News of the engagement traveled through 2 Corps with the speed of mythology. By evening, Morrison's company commander had filed an after-action report. By the following day, the incident had reached divisional headquarters. By the end of the week, staff officers from 3 different departments, operations, intelligence, and ordnance, had interviewed Morrison separately, each trying to understand exactly what had happened, exactly how doctrine had failed, exactly what this strange, forbidden rhythm meant. Morrison himself could not explain it. In the formal interview transcripts, now declassified and stored in the National Archives, his answers are halting, uncertain, almost apologetic. He had not planned to fire sustained bursts. He had simply reacted. Something about the dive angle, the speed, the way the Stuka moved through space, it had demanded a different response. He had felt the rhythm before he understood it. His body had known something his mind had not yet learned. The ordnance officers were particularly interested in the ammunition expenditure. 110 rounds fired, 11 hits, a 10% hit rate under combat conditions against maneuvering aircraft. By comparison, the average hit rate for anti-aircraft machine guns in 1943 was approximately 2 to 3%. Morrison's performance was not merely good. It was statistically anomalous. Either he had been extraordinarily lucky, 3 aircraft destroyed by coincidence, or something else had occurred, something the doctrine had not accounted for. They examined the Browning M2 Morrison had used. The barrel showed heat stress but no structural failure. The timing mechanism was intact. The headspace was still within tolerance. Mechanically, the gun had performed exactly as designed. The difference was not in the weapon. The difference was in how it had been used. What emerged from the subsequent analysis, conducted quietly without fanfare, in technical journals that only specialists read, was a recognition that the doctrine of short bursts was based on assumptions that no longer held. It assumed static defensive positions, as in the First World War. It assumed enemies who advanced slowly across open ground in massed formations. It assumed time to aim, time to fire, time to assess, time to re-engage. Against aircraft diving at 300 miles per hour, there was no time. There was only rhythm. The pilots who survived encounters with American machine gunners in subsequent engagements began reporting something strange. Not increased accuracy. Accuracy had always varied, but something they called wall fire. Instead of sporadic bursts, some American gunners were laying down sustained streams that created what German pilots described as a wall of tracers, a visible barrier in 3-dimensional space that aircraft could not safely penetrate. It was suppressive fire translated into the vertical dimension. It did not rely on precision. It relied on volume, on creating a zone of such intense fire density that evasion became impossible. The Luftwaffe intelligence analysts noted this change. In captured documents from 1943 and early 1944, German tactical reports begin advising pilots to avoid certain types of American positions, specifically those defended by 50-caliber machine guns manned by gunners who did not observe fire discipline. The phrase appears multiple times, always with a note of frustration. Fire discipline, from the German perspective, was something they could predict and exploit. Undisciplined fire, sustained, rhythmic, profligate with ammunition, was harder to counter because it transformed the battlefield geometry. It was not about hitting the target. It was about filling the space where the target needed to be. Eugene Morrison was not the only American gunner who discovered this rhythm. As 1943 progressed into 1944, as Green troops became veterans, and veterans became survivors, others learned the same lesson independently. Private James Hendricks in Italy, Corporal Robert Yamamoto in the Pacific, Staff Sergeant William King in France. Each of them, under fire, abandoned doctrine and found the rhythm, that forbidden cadence of sustained automatic fire, that doctrine prohibited but reality demanded. The military establishment responded slowly. Doctrine is not easily changed, especially in wartime, especially when the existing doctrine is backed by decades of institutional belief. But gradually, quietly, adjustments were made. Training bulletins were revised. Instructors at gunnery schools began teaching alternate techniques. Situational fire control was the euphemism that allowed for sustained bursts against fast-moving aerial targets. The sacred rule of 3 to 5 rounds remained in the manual, but footnotes appeared. Exceptions were acknowledged. The rhythm, though still never officially named, was tacitly permitted. By 1945, the average .50 caliber gunner in the American military was firing longer bursts than his 1942 counterpart. Not because regulations had changed. They hadn't. Not formally, but because the unofficial knowledge had spread through the organism of the military, the way all vital knowledge spreads, through survival. The gunners who used the rhythm lived longer. Those who adhered strictly to doctrine died more frequently. Evolution occurred at the speed of combat. What Eugene Morrison had discovered, what those 11 seconds in the Tunisian desert had revealed, was something deeper than tactics. It was a truth about the nature of abundance itself, about the American way of war, about what happens when industrial capacity meets existential threat. The German military in 1943 was still operating under assumptions forged by scarcity. Germany had fewer resources, less oil, constrained manufacturing capacity. German doctrine emphasized precision, economy, efficiency, maximizing effect while minimizing expenditure. Every bullet was precious. Every shell was counted. Logistics was a constant knife edge, and waste was not merely inefficient, but potentially catastrophic. The German soldier was trained to be precise because Germany could not afford profligacy. The American military was built differently. By 1943, the industrial mobilization of the United States had reached a scale that defied comprehension. Factories that had produced automobiles now produced aircraft, one bomber every hour around the clock. Steel mills that had made girders now made artillery shells by the millions. The .50 caliber ammunition that Morrison had expended in 11 seconds. 110 rounds represented approximately 23 seconds of production time at the Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri, which by 1943 was producing 288 million rounds per year. This was the advantage Morrison carried into combat, though he did not know it. Not superior training, not better tactics, not individual martial prowess. He carried the weight of an entire economy organized for total war, an industrial base so vast that expenditure was not a liability but a doctrine in itself. He could fire 110 rounds because America could make 110 million rounds. He could overheat the barrel because another barrel could be manufactured before nightfall. He could violate the conservation principles that scarcity demanded because he fought from a position of abundance. The Germans understood this eventually. In the memoirs and post-war accounts of Wehrmacht officers, a recurring theme emerges: the shock of American material superiority, not tactical brilliance. German officers generally considered themselves superior in tactical execution, but the simple, crushing weight of logistics. One German battalion commander, captured in France in 1944, told his interrogators that fighting the Americans was like fighting a department store. You destroy one tank and 3 more appear. You shoot down one aircraft and 10 more take its place. It is not war. It is drowning. This was the symbolism that Morrison's rhythm represented, though no one articulated it at the time. The Browning M2, firing sustained bursts in defiance of doctrine, was not merely a weapon. It was a statement. It said, "We have so much that we can afford to waste. We have so many bullets that conservation is irrelevant. We have an industrial base so vast that our definition of excess is your definition of impossible." The sound of it, that continuous roar, that forbidden rhythm, was the sound of American abundance translated into violence. It was democracy weaponized not through superior ideology, but through superior production. It was freedom expressed not as an abstract ideal, but as the physical fact of unlimited fire support. The American soldier did not need to be more disciplined than his German counterpart because discipline, in the old sense, was a response to scarcity. The American soldier had different problems: how to carry enough ammunition, how to dissipate enough heat, how to sustain a rate of fire that would have bankrupted any other military on Earth. Eugene Morrison, gripping the handles of the Browning M2 in that moment of terror and instinct, became the unwitting avatar of this transformation. He did not win through skill alone. He won because the economic system behind him had made victory possible by removing the constraint of scarcity. He could hold the trigger down because Ford Motor Company and General Motors and Chrysler and 1,000 other manufacturers had made holding the trigger down logistically feasible. The 3 Stuka pilots who died that morning had names, though Morrison never learned them. Oberleutnant Hans Kleber, age 27, veteran of the campaigns in Poland and France, recipient of the Iron Cross Second Class. Feldwebel Otto Rauscher, age 23, married, 1 child, from a village outside Munich where his father ran a bakery. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Strasser, age 20, still called the Kid by his squadron mates, 2 months in theater, 7 combat missions completed, 3 to go before rotation back to training command. They had expected what everyone expected in early 1943, that the Americans were inexperienced, poorly coordinated, prone to panic under air attack. The intelligence briefings before the mission had emphasized American disorganization following the defeats at Kasserine Pass. The ground troops would scatter. The anti-aircraft fire would be sporadic. The mission would be routine. Another dive, another target, another small victory in the long attrition of North African warfare. They had not expected the rhythm. In the cockpit of the lead Stuka, in those final seconds before the Browning's bullets tore through metal and flesh, Kleber probably had time to realize that something had gone wrong. The tracer stream should have been intermittent, easy to evade. Instead, it was continuous, a solid rope of fire that his dive had carried him into, like a moth into a candle flame. Perhaps he tried to pull out. Perhaps he simply didn't have time. The impact was instantaneous. One moment flight. The next moment physics asserting its absolute authority. Rauscher, in the second aircraft, saw his leader go down and made the correct tactical decision to break left. But tactics assume certain things about the enemy's capabilities, and Morrison's capabilities had exceeded what tactics anticipated. The rhythm followed him. The discipline broke him. When his aircraft hit the desert, the photograph in his cockpit, his wife and infant son, carried for luck, survived the impact intact, a small rectangle of normalcy amid the wreckage, recovered later by Graves registration, and eventually returned to his widow with a letter of condolence that explained nothing about rhythm or doctrine or industrial abundance. Strasser, the youngest, the one who almost escaped, died without understanding why. He had done everything correctly. Released ordnance, broke contact, initiated climb. The textbook escape. But textbooks are written from accumulated experience, and no one had accumulated experience against an enemy who could afford to sustain fire until statistical improbability became certainty. The single round that killed him, entering through the rear canopy, traversing the cockpit, striking the medulla oblongata, was one of 110 fired. 11 hit. 3 killed him specifically. In a different context, in a conflict governed by scarcity, that round would never have been fired. The gunner would have stopped at 30 rounds, conserving ammunition. Strasser would have climbed away. He would have returned to base. He would have flown again the next day and the day after, accumulating missions until he reached rotation, until he returned to Germany, until the war ended. If it ended, and he could begin the ordinary life that 20-year-olds imagine stretches infinitely before them. But scarcity did not govern this conflict. Abundance did, and abundance killed him. Morrison himself was recommended for decoration, a Silver Star for valor under fire. The recommendation was approved, then quietly downgraded to a Bronze Star when someone in the chain of command noted that he had technically violated doctrine, and it would be awkward to award high valor decorations for actions that contradicted official regulations. The Bronze Star was presented in a brief ceremony 3 weeks later. Morrison accepted it with the bewildered grace of young men everywhere who receive recognition for actions they still do not fully understand. He was transferred shortly after to a training unit in Morocco, where he spent 6 weeks teaching other gunners what he had learned. The informal curriculum was called Aerial Engagement Techniques, though everyone simply called it Morrison's Rhythm. He demonstrated sustained fire. He explained, as well as he could explain, the feeling of matching cadence to target movement. He tried to convey something that existed beyond words, beyond doctrine, in the realm of instinct and improvisation where survival lives. Most of his students nodded politely and forgot everything immediately. Doctrine was comfortable. Doctrine was what their instructors had taught them at Fort Benning and Fort Bliss and Camp Roberts. Doctrine was the safe answer on the examination, the approved response in the training manual. Morrison's rhythm was none of these things. It was dangerous. Dangerous to the gun, dangerous to ammunition supply, dangerous to the institutional certainty that regulations existed for good reasons and should not be casually abandoned. But some listened, some understood, and those were the ones who survived when the Stukas came again, when the Zeros came, when the sky filled with steel and purpose, and the only thing that mattered was whether you could throw enough lead into the air fast enough to make mathematics bend in your favor. By war's end, Morrison had rotated back to the United States, had been demobilized, had returned to his pre-war job as a machinist in a factory in Ohio that once made agricultural equipment and now made nothing because the contracts had dried up and the workers had dispersed to other industries, other lives. He did not speak much about the war. When people asked, and in those years everyone asked, he offered the standard responses: hot, sandy, scary sometimes, glad to be home. He did not mention the rhythm. He did not mention the 11 seconds. He did not mention the 3 pillars of smoke, or the way his hands had shaken afterward, or the dreams that visited him occasionally where he heard the Jericho trumpet again and reached for controls that weren't there. He lived until 1987, dying quietly of heart failure at age 66. His obituary in the local newspaper, a brief paragraph noting his wartime service and his 40 years at the factory, and his survival by 2 children and 5 grandchildren. The Bronze Star was in a box in his attic. The citation mentioned engagement with enemy aircraft. It did not mention the rhythm. The Browning M2 machine gun remained in American service long after Morrison, long after the war, long after the generation that fought it had aged into memory. It is still in service now, 80 years later, the longest-serving small arm in American military history. Millions have been manufactured. Hundreds of thousands remain in inventory. The design has been refined, but never fundamentally changed, because the original design achieved something rare. It balanced power, reliability, and sustainability in a package that industrial production could replicate infinitely. The doctrine surrounding its use has changed, though slowly, reluctantly, with the institutional resistance that all military establishments display toward revision. The 3 to 5 round burst is no longer sacred writ. Modern training acknowledges what Morrison discovered in 11 seconds. That sustained fire against fast-moving targets is not waste, but necessity. That volume sometimes matters more than precision. That the rhythm exists and must be taught even if it cannot be fully codified. In the technical manuals, the current versions, updated and revised through decades of combat experience. in Korea and Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, and a dozen smaller conflicts whose names most Americans never learned. There are sections on suppressive fire patterns and area denial, techniques and high-tempo engagement, protocols. These are the bureaucratic euphemisms for Morrison's rhythm. They are doctrine catching up to reality. They are the institutional acknowledgement that abundance changes everything, including how weapons are employed, including what is forbidden and what is necessary. The modern American military gunner, trained on ranges in Georgia and California and North Carolina, learns to fire sustained bursts. The instructors, none of whom know Morrison's name, none of whom have read the declassified after-action reports from Tunisia, teach the rhythm without knowing its origin story. They teach it because it works, because statistical analysis has demonstrated its effectiveness, because the ammunition supply chain can support it. They teach it because scarcity is not an American military problem. Other problems exist: political problems, strategic problems, moral problems, but scarcity is not among them. This is Morrison's legacy, though it bears no name and credits no author. It is written in tracer rounds and target scoring and the muscle memory of 10,000 gunners who have never heard of Kasserine Pass. It is the institutional acknowledgement that doctrine must sometimes bow to reality, that regulations are provisional truths, that survival teaches lessons that no manual can anticipate. In the end, what Morrison discovered was not really about machine guns or aircraft or the technical specifications of combat. It was about the space between theory and practice, about the moment when doctrine meets reality and breaks. It was about the willingness, born from terror and instinct, and the immediate necessity of not dying, to abandon certainty and improvise. The American military in early 1943 believed in conservation because conservation had always been necessary. Morrison did not consciously reject this belief. He simply acted, in 11 seconds of sustained fire, on a truth that his body understood before his mind. That he lived in a different kind of war now, fought by a different kind of nation, with different resources and different possibilities. He pulled the trigger and held it there, not because he had calculated the logistics, but because the Stukas were falling and calculation was a luxury the moment did not permit. The 3 aircraft fell because Morrison held the trigger. The trigger could be held because the ammunition existed. The ammunition existed because factories in Missouri and Pennsylvania and Illinois ran 24 hours a day producing millions of rounds that would be fired by thousands of gunners in hundreds of engagements across 3 continents. The factories ran because the economy could support them. The economy could support them because the industrial base was vast enough to feed both civilian needs and military consumption without collapsing into scarcity. This was the chain of causation that connected a machinist from Ohio to 3 German pilots dying in the Tunisian desert. This was the hidden architecture of American victory, not moral superiority or tactical genius or individual heroism, though all of those existed, but the simple, overwhelming fact of material abundance. Morrison could fire 110 rounds because America could make 110 billion. He could violate doctrine because doctrine was written for armies that counted bullets. America, by 1943, had stopped counting. The Germans, in their post-war analysis, understood this. The most honest accounts, the ones written by officers with no remaining stake in propaganda or national pride, acknowledge that Germany lost not because German soldiers were inferior but because German industry could not match American production. The Wehrmacht fought with discipline and skill and courage, and it lost because discipline cannot defeat abundance, skill cannot overcome logistics, and courage cannot stop the machine when the machine is fed by an economy that produces more in a month than you produce in a year. This is the uncomfortable truth that Morrison's rhythm revealed, that war between industrial nations is ultimately a contest of production capacity, and that all the tactical brilliance in the world cannot compensate for a tenfold disadvantage in material. The Americans did not need to be better soldiers. They only needed to be adequate soldiers backed by superior logistics. Morrison was an adequate soldier. He had adequate training. He fired an adequate weapon. And he destroyed 3 aircraft because adequacy multiplied by abundance equals dominance. The desert where the Stukas fell has long since erased the evidence. The wreckage was cleared away in 1943, salvaged for scrap metal that itself was recycled into the war economy. German aluminum returning to the material stream to be reformed into American aircraft or British tanks or Canadian artillery shells, the impact craters filled with sand. The burn marks faded. The exact location of the engagement is no longer precisely known. Somewhere southeast of Kasserine Pass, along a wadi that branched into other wadis, in terrain that looks identical for hundreds of miles in every direction. Morrison never returned. He had no desire to see the place again. No wish to walk ground where 3 men had died because of 11 seconds he could barely remember and did not fully understand. In the rare moments when he spoke about it, late at night, with family, when the protective silence wore thin, he expressed neither pride nor regret. He spoke of it as something that had happened to him rather than something he had done, as if he had been an observer at his own actions, watching a stranger named Morrison pull a trigger and change the trajectory of events in ways that only made sense later, in analysis, in the cold reconstruction of what instinct had achieved. The historians who study North Africa, who map the campaigns and battles and small engagements that accumulated into victory, rarely mention the incident. It does not fit the grand narrative. No territory changed hands. No strategic objective was secured. 3 aircraft fell and the war continued. And a week later no one remembered except the men who had been there and the families who received telegrams beginning with the words, "The War Department regrets to inform you." But the rhythm persisted. It persisted in training manuals and tactical doctrine and the accumulated knowledge of gunners who learned. As Morrison learned, that survival sometimes requires abandoning what you were taught in favor of what the moment demands. It persisted in the sound of the Browning M2 firing sustained bursts, in the specific cadence of heavy machine gun fire that became one of the signature sounds of American military operations, as recognizable as the howl of dive bombers or the crack of rifle fire or the rumble of tank tracks. It persisted because it was true. Not true in the doctrinal sense, not true in the regulatory sense, but true in the deeper sense that combat reveals. That effectiveness matters more than orthodoxy, that survival outranks protocol, that the space between what is permitted and what is necessary is where actual war occurs, as opposed to the theoretical war that doctrine describes. Somewhere in the records, in the vast archives where the American military stores its institutional memory, the after-action report from January 17, 1943, still exists. It is filed under 2 Corps operations, North Africa Theater, routine engagement reports. The pages are yellowed now, the typing faded, the signatures of men long dead still visible at the bottom of each page. The report is factual, clinical, written in the bureaucratic prose that military documentation requires. It notes the time of engagement, the units involved, the enemy aircraft destroyed, the ammunition expended, the personnel commendations recommended. It does not mention the rhythm. It does not capture the sound of the Jericho trumpets, or the way Morrison's hands shook afterward, or the fact that 3 young men died confused, not understanding why their training had failed them, why the Americans had not behaved as Americans were supposed to behave. It does not explain what changed that morning. What truth was revealed in 11 seconds of sustained fire that would propagate through the rest of the war and beyond, shaping how the American military understood automatic weapons employment for the next 8 decades. But the truth is there, between the lines, in the numbers. 110 rounds fired, 11 hits, 3 aircraft destroyed, numbers that should not work, that violate the statistical expectations of anti-aircraft fire, that only make sense when you understand that Morrison was not aiming, not in the conventional sense. He was creating a zone of fire so dense that evasion became impossible. He was filling space with lead until space itself became hostile to flight. He was using abundance as a weapon. using America's industrial capacity as a tactical tool, using the forbidden rhythm that doctrine prohibited, but reality required. This was the lesson. This was what the three Stukas taught by dying, what Morrison learned by surviving, what the American military gradually, reluctantly incorporated into its understanding of modern war. That abundance changes the calculus, that the rules written for scarcity do not apply when resources are effectively unlimited, that sometimes the forbidden rhythm is the only rhythm that works. The Browning M2 still fires today in that same rhythm, in places whose names will appear in future after-action reports filed in future archives. The gunners who fire it still learn the doctrine of short, controlled bursts. And then, when the moment demands it, when the enemy is close and fast and lethal, they hold the trigger down and let the rhythm speak. That forbidden cadence, that sound of abundance, that simple, terrible truth that Morrison discovered in 11 seconds in the Tunisian desert on a January morning in 1943, when the sky fell and he did not.